James and Olivia Matthews. They were a picture-perfect duo, well-dressed, successful, and always the center of attention at local parties. Their marriage, however, wasn't as it seemed. They had an open marriage, a rare and controversial choice for their conservative neighborhood, which led to gossip, but to the outside world, they appeared to have it all. James, a wealthy tech entrepreneur, was the kind of man who preferred to keep things complicated. His fortune came from his innovative software company, which was rapidly growing, and he lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town. Olivia, his wife, was equally ambitious, but in a more traditional sense. A former lawyer turned art gallery owner, she had a sharp mind and a desire for the finer things in life. Though James and Olivia lived under the same roof, their marriage was unconventional. Both had relationships outside of their marriage, and the rules were clear. Nothing was to be hidden. They were each other's best friends, companions, and business partners, but emotionally, they had long since stopped being in love. It was a business arrangement, and for years it worked for both of them. That was until Olivia's desire for more began to grow. James had always been careful with his wealth, protecting it with legal trusts and airtight financial documents. But Olivia had her eyes set on something greater, his inheritance. She had been growing restless with the arrangement, and after years of tolerating his behavior and indulging in her own affairs, she began planning. She knew that James would never leave her, but if something were to happen to him, she would inherit everything. Her plan was simple: find a way to get rid of James while making it look like an accident, then claim his fortune. Olivia carefully plotted her plan for months, all the while keeping up the facade of a loving wife. She took care of James's needs, made sure he was in good health, and never let on that she was secretly preparing to end their marriage in the most permanent way possible. On the night of James's death, it was like any other. He had returned from a meeting with investors, in a good mood, eager to relax in the mansion. He made himself a drink in the living room, where Olivia joined him. The two shared casual conversation, and James had no idea that this would be his last night. Olivia had slipped something into James's drink, an overdose of a rare, hard-to-detect poison. James took a few sips before excusing himself to the study. He felt ill almost immediately, but didn't suspect anything. Within hours, he collapsed at his desk, dead before anyone could come to his aid. Olivia called for help, feigning surprise and panic. The authorities arrived quickly, and the initial assumption was that James had died from a sudden health complication. But there were no signs of struggle, no robbery, and no obvious injuries. Olivia, though visibly shaken, was calm and composed, offering no suspicions to the officers. The next few weeks were a blur of mourning, funeral arrangements, and the reading of James's will. Olivia's grief was palpable, and she appeared devastated by the sudden loss. But behind her tear-filled eyes, there was something else, something darker. Olivia knew that she would soon be the owner of everything James had built. However, little did she know, a seasoned investigator, Detective Samuel Grant, was already starting to see cracks in the story. Grant had dealt with more complicated cases than he cared to remember, but something about James's sudden death didn't sit right with him. Despite Olivia's flawless act, he could sense a lie lurking beneath the surface. Detective Samuel Grant was known for his keen eye and meticulous attention to detail. He had spent nearly 20 years in law enforcement, and his experience had taught him that most cases were not as simple as they appeared. When he was assigned to investigate the sudden death of James Matthews, he felt an instinctual pull to dig deeper. Everything about the case seemed too clean, too easy. A man found dead at his desk in the middle of the night, with no signs of struggle or forced entry into the house. It was almost as if someone had planned it to be this way. Grant's first stop was to visit the scene of the crime, James's grand mansion on the outskirts of Clearwater. He had already reviewed the initial police reports, but something about them didn't add up. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the officers hadn't considered a toxic substance. It was standard procedure to look for poisons in unexplained deaths, but they had been too quick to close the case. When Grant arrived, Olivia Matthews was already there, standing in the front yard with a few of her closest friends. She was still dressed in mourning, her eyes red from crying. She appeared fragile, delicate, like a woman who had just lost everything. But to Grant, her demeanor felt rehearsed, too controlled for someone who had just suffered a devastating loss. She was playing the part of the grieving widow too perfectly, and Grant was determined to find out why. He spoke with the responding officers first. They recounted the events of the night James died. Olivia had called 911 after finding her husband collapsed at his desk. She had tried to revive him, but it was clear he was already gone by the time they arrived. There was no sign of foul play, nothing suspicious at all. They had assumed it was a natural death. The officers had gone over the house thoroughly, but there were no indications of a break-in, and everything seemed in place. Grant decided to take a closer look at the house himself. He wasn't about to make any assumptions just yet, but he was certain that something had gone wrong here. He toured the study where James had been found, taking note of the layout, the furniture, and the absence of any personal items that might hint at an argument or struggle. There was nothing unusual, just an expensive, perfectly maintained space. He asked to speak with the housekeeper, a woman named Clara, who had worked for the Matthews family for over 10 years. Clara was in her late 60s, and she had been with the family long before James and Olivia's open marriage. She seemed genuinely distraught over James's death, but Grant wondered how much she truly knew. "Did you notice anything unusual in the house that night?" he asked her. Clara paused for a moment, her eyes drifting downward as though she were considering her response carefully. "No, detective, nothing unusual. It was just another evening. I left around 8 p.m. after dinner. They were having drinks in the living room like they always do." She hesitated. "But I did hear something strange now that you mention it. A noise, almost like a thud, around 10:30 p.m. I thought it was just the wind, or maybe James dropping something. I didn't think much of it." "A thud?" Grant repeated, his interest piqued. "You didn't think it was anything worth investigating?" "No, sir," Clara replied. "By the time I heard it, I was already in my room upstairs. I didn't hear anything else, and the house is so large it could have come from anywhere." Grant nodded, making a mental note. The noise could have been nothing, but it was worth remembering. He thanked Clara and moved on to his next task, reviewing James's medical history. The initial cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Grant wasn't convinced. He arranged for a toxicology report to be done on James's body. Given the suddenness of the death and the lack of obvious signs of illness or trauma, it was possible that James had been poisoned. But what kind of poison? And why would Olivia be involved? The toxicology results came in just 2 days later. The cause of death was not heart failure after all, but poisoning, specifically a rare substance called ricin, a potent toxin that can be fatal in even small doses. The substance was difficult to detect unless specifically tested for, and it explained why the initial investigation had missed it. Ricin could be delivered through food or drink, and it didn't take much to cause death. In fact, it was often used in covert assassinations due to its slow, agonizing effects. Grant was now certain that James had been murdered, but who could have done it? And why? The investigator called in Olivia for questioning. She had been cooperative so far, but now Grant had enough evidence to ask more pointed questions. She sat down across from him in the small interrogation room, her face still pale, her eyes swollen from the grief of losing her husband. She seemed nervous, but she maintained her composure. Detective Samuel Grant knew that Olivia Matthews was hiding something, but he couldn't yet prove it. Her story was filled with holes, and the discovery of ricin in her husband's system had only deepened the mystery. He had a gut feeling that there was more to this than just a simple murder for inheritance. There was a web of lies and deceit waiting to be uncovered, and he wasn't going to let Olivia slip away without answering his questions. Grant's next move was to dig into Olivia's past, specifically her relationships and interactions leading up to James's death. A woman like Olivia, ambitious and well-connected, must have had people who could help her execute a plan like this. He started by reviewing her social circle, friends, business partners, and acquaintances, and soon enough a name stood out: Daniel Hawk. Daniel was a former colleague of Olivia's when she was still practicing law. He was a criminal defense attorney known for his sharp mind and questionable methods. There were rumors that Olivia and Daniel had been more than just friends in the past, though they both denied any romantic involvement. Regardless, Grant felt that Daniel might be key to understanding the full picture. If Olivia was planning something as drastic as her husband's murder, she'd likely have confided in someone close to her. Grant decided to pay Daniel a visit. He wasn't sure if the man would be cooperative, but a little pressure could reveal more than he anticipated. Daniel's office was located in a sleek downtown building, the kind that spoke of wealth and power. When Grant walked in, he was met with the unmistakable look of someone who had been through the legal system too many times. Daniel was in his late 40s, tall with a weathered face that didn't quite match the youthful confidence he projected. "Detective Grant," Daniel greeted him with a warm smile, though his eyes held an edge. "What brings you to my office? I assume you're here to talk about James Matthews?" Grant didn't beat around the bush. "I need to know everything about your relationship with Olivia Matthews. When was the last time you spoke to her?" Daniel's expression didn't change, but he stiffened slightly. "Olivia, we've had the occasional chat, but nothing unusual. She's been understandably upset since James died. We were friends once, but that's a long time ago. I'm not sure how this relates to James's death, Detective." Grant wasn't convinced. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "I believe you're lying, Mr. Hawk. You and Olivia had a lot more than a casual friendship, didn't you? I think you've been helping her plan something for a long time. What's your involvement in her husband's death?" Daniel's smile faltered for a moment, then returned, colder than before. "Look, Detective, I don't know what you're trying to imply, but you're way off base. Olivia has been grieving. She's devastated. I've been supporting her through a difficult time. That's all there is to it." Grant pressed further. "Do you know anything about ricin, the substance used to poison James?" At the mention of ricin, Daniel's face twitched, almost imperceptibly. "Ricin? That's, that's a rare poison, not something you just find lying around. Why would you think it was ricin?" Grant's eyes narrowed. "You seem to know a lot about it. Funny how you'd know the exact nature of the poison used to kill James without being told." Daniel's posture shifted. He leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. "You're grasping at straws, Detective. If Olivia were involved, she'd never trust me with something like this. I haven't seen her in months." Grant wasn't sure if Daniel was lying or simply trying to distance himself from a potential scandal. But one thing was certain: his reaction was strange. People who had nothing to hide didn't act so defensive. "Have you ever heard of James's will?" Grant asked, changing tactics. Daniel's face went blank, but there was a flicker of something, unease perhaps, before he regained his composure. "Yes, I've heard of it, but I don't know the details." "Why?" Grant stood up, prepared to leave. "Because I'm about to find out how deep this goes, and I have a feeling you're involved, whether you like it or not." He left the office with more questions than answers. Daniel's behavior was suspicious, but Grant didn't have enough to link him directly to the crime yet. He needed more concrete evidence, and his next stop was Olivia's bank records. He had already gathered information about James's fortune, which was substantial, and he knew that if Olivia were planning something drastic, she would likely have moved money around to cover her tracks. Grant worked with his team to subpoena Olivia's financial records. What he found only raised more questions. Over the past 6 months, there had been a series of large, unexplained withdrawals from her account. Detective Samuel Grant had all the pieces of the puzzle laid out before him, but something still didn't sit right. He now had undeniable proof that Olivia Matthews had orchestrated the murder of her husband James in a cold and calculated bid to secure his fortune. She had poisoned him with ricin, sourced from a chemical company in Europe, and had even taken the time to research the substance's properties. But as Grant's investigation dug deeper, he realized that the truth was far murkier than a simple case of greed. It wasn't just Olivia who was involved in the scheme. The more Grant thought about the strange reaction from Daniel Hawk, the former lawyer turned criminal defense attorney, the more he became convinced that there was someone else pulling the strings behind the scenes. Olivia may have been the mastermind, but who was her accomplice? Who else had the means, the knowledge, and the motive to help her carry out such a meticulous plan? The answer came when Grant started looking into Daniel's past. He was more than just a criminal lawyer. He had ties to several shady figures in Clearwater, including a network of black market traders who dealt in weapons, chemicals, and various illicit substances. These connections were not common knowledge, and they weren't the kind of things you would casually mention to someone who might be digging into your life. Grant knew he had to find a way to link Daniel directly to the crime. He started by re-interviewing the key players in Olivia's life, those who had been closest to her in the weeks leading up to James's death. He wanted to find out if anyone had witnessed anything suspicious or unusual that might point to a collaboration between Olivia and Daniel. One of the people Grant spoke to was Clara, the Matthews family housekeeper. She had already provided some useful information, but Grant wasn't sure if she had revealed everything she knew. So he revisited her, hoping she could offer more. Clara seemed genuinely upset when Grant walked into the kitchen of the Matthews mansion. She was tidying up as though she hadn't stopped since the death of James. Her hands were trembling, her eyes weary from too many nights spent worrying about her employer's personal lives. "Detective Grant," she said softly, as if hesitant to speak. I don't know what else you want from me. I told you everything I know." "I know, Clara," Grant replied, his voice calm but insistent. "But I need to ask you one more thing. Did you ever see Olivia with anyone unusual in the days leading up to James's death? Someone who seemed out of place, maybe?" Clara paused, looking away, as if struggling with a memory. Then her eyes darted back to Grant, wide with realization. "There was someone," she said, almost whispering. "A man. I think he was a friend of hers. Or more than a friend, maybe. He came by the house a few times. I saw them together in the garden one evening, talking very quietly, like they were planning something." "Did you hear what they were talking about?" Grant pressed. Clara shook her head. "No, I couldn't make out the words, but I could tell it was serious. She was, different with him, detective. More urgent. I've worked for the Matthews family for over 10 years, and I've never seen her act that way with anyone before." "Did you see who he was?" Grant asked, his heart quickening. Clara looked nervous, wringing her hands. "He was tall, with dark hair, and a foreign accent, I think. Not local, for sure. I didn't get a good look at him, but I know it wasn't someone from around here." This was the breakthrough Grant had been waiting for. A man, a stranger, who had been visiting Olivia in secret. A foreigner, someone not tied to Clearwater. Grant's mind immediately went to the possibility that this was Daniel Hawk. If Daniel had been helping Olivia with the plot from the shadows, then it made sense that he would visit her under the cover of darkness. He had the skills and the knowledge to be her partner in crime. Someone who could keep things quiet and help her cover her tracks. Grant was now certain that Olivia had an accomplice, and that accomplice was none other than Daniel Hawk. The connection was too strong to ignore, but the question remained: how far did this partnership go? Was Daniel in love with Olivia, or was this just business for him? Grant called in Daniel for questioning once again. This time he wasn't going to let him off the hook. He had enough evidence to arrest him, but he needed a confession. He knew that people like Daniel were masters at lying, at twisting the truth, but Grant was prepared to outsmart him. Daniel walked into the interrogation room, his expression unreadable. He sat down across from Grant, folding his arms with a sense of defiance. "I thought we were done here, Detective," Daniel said with a small, knowing smile. "I've already told you everything I know." Detective Samuel Grant's mind raced as he left the interrogation room. Daniel Hawk's cryptic words echoed in his ears. "The man who's been pulling the strings." It was clear now that the investigation wasn't just about Olivia Matthews or her manipulations. There was a deeper conspiracy at play, one that involved a powerful and dangerous figure who had been hiding in the shadows. Grant's first task was to follow the breadcrumb trail left by Daniel's words. This business partner of Olivia's, who was this person, and how was he involved in James's death? If Olivia had a backer who was supplying her with resources, connections, and the means to execute such a sophisticated crime, then this was the final piece of the puzzle Grant had been searching for. He started by reviewing all of Olivia's business dealings. The Matthews Art Gallery was her most visible project, but it wasn't the only one. There were numerous investments, high-value transactions, and partnerships she had quietly formed over the years. One name stood out: Victor Moreno. A real estate mogul with ties to international business, Moreno was known for his wealth and influence. He owned several art galleries in major cities around the world, including a few in Europe, and had a reputation for funding emerging artists and cutting-edge art projects. Olivia had frequently mentioned him in her public dealings, always as a supporter of her gallery. Grant dug deeper into Moreno's background. What he found wasn't just impressive wealth, it was a complex network of shady connections and dealings that spanned continents. He was rumored to have ties to organized crime in Europe, as well as to politicians and businessmen who preferred to operate in the dark. He was someone with the means to make problems disappear, someone who wouldn't hesitate to use his wealth to control people, even kill if necessary. But what was his connection to Olivia, and how deep did his involvement in James's murder run? Grant's next step was to find out more about Moreno's recent activities, specifically his involvement in the chemical company where Olivia had acquired the ricin. It was a long shot, but if Moreno had ties to the company, he could have been the one facilitating the purchase. A quick inquiry through international channels revealed a startling link. Victor Moreno was one of the primary investors in the chemical company. This explained how Olivia had been able to gain access to such a rare and deadly poison without raising suspicion. The realization hit Grant like a punch to the gut. Olivia was working for someone far more dangerous than herself. She had not only been using Daniel Hawk as a pawn, but she had also been playing a dangerous game with someone who had the power to destroy lives without hesitation. Grant needed to confront Olivia. He wasn't sure if she was fully aware of the extent of Moreno's involvement, but if she wasn't, she soon would be. The truth was about to come crashing down on her, and she wouldn't be able to hide behind her calculated charm any longer. Later that day, Grant met with Olivia once again, this time at the police station. He had all the evidence he needed to make an arrest: financial records, the toxicology report, and the damning link to Victor Moreno. But he had to make sure Olivia knew she couldn't outsmart him this time. "Mrs. Matthews," Grant began, his voice steady, "I have something I think you need to hear." Olivia looked up at him, her face pale but composed. She had been expecting this confrontation, but her confidence was starting to waver. She knew the game was up, but she wasn't going to admit defeat without a fight. "Go on," she said, her voice clipped. "James didn't die just because of you," Grant said. "You didn't do this alone. You had help. Help from someone more powerful, more dangerous than you ever let on. Victor Moreno, he's the one who helped you get the ricin, the one who funded your little plan to take everything from your husband. And I'm willing to bet that he's the one who really had you take James out of the picture. Not just for his money, but for something else." Olivia's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't surprised. Grant had been digging into her life for days, and she knew that eventually he would find the connection to Moreno. She'd taken precautions, of course, but she had underestimated Grant's persistence. "Victor?" Olivia said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think I'm working for him? You don't know anything about what's going on. You don't understand the game." "The game," Grant repeated, leaning in. "I know everything I need to know. Moreno's been pulling the strings from the start. You didn't kill James for money, Olivia. You did it for control, for power. You wanted to position yourself at the top of the art world, and James was a stepping stone. You needed him out of the way, and you had your hands dirty long before he ever met his end." The walls of Clearwater's police headquarters felt like they were closing in on Detective Samuel Grant. Olivia Matthews had been confident, even defiant, in her interrogation. She hadn't cracked. She had only deepened the mystery. The more Grant uncovered, the more he realized that the murder of James Matthew was part of something much larger than a simple inheritance grab. There was an entire web of power, manipulation, and deceit, and at its center was Victor Moreno. Grant's instincts told him that Olivia was not the mastermind. She was just a pawn in a far more elaborate game. But who was really pulling the strings? Who had orchestrated this entire operation, manipulating both Olivia and James's murder as mere steps in a larger scheme? To figure this out, Grant needed to find out more about Victor Moreno's role. He couldn't just rely on what Olivia and Daniel Hawk had said. He needed hard evidence, and that meant digging into Moreno's business dealings, his associates, and any potential enemies. The breakthrough came when Grant received a sealed envelope at his desk, a tip-off that would push him closer to the truth. Inside was a set of flight records, a list of travel logs for someone who had traveled extensively between Europe and the United States over the past year. One name stood out: Leonard Volkov, a high-profile businessman with ties to illegal arms deals and black market operations. His name had surfaced in Grant's previous investigations, but he had never been directly involved in any of the cases. Volkov had been on the radar for years, suspected of running a powerful network in the criminal underworld. He was rumored to have connections to figures in both organized crime and high-level government corruption. What was Volkov's connection to Moreno? Grant ran Volkov's name through the system. Sure enough, there were records of business dealings between Volkov and Victor Moreno, especially in the realm of high-value real estate and private investments. But what caught Grant's attention was a specific deal they had made 6 months ago, a deal that involved buying up distressed properties in Eastern Europe, properties that had once been used to house chemical laboratories. The connection between these transactions and the chemical company Olivia had sourced the ricin from was undeniable. Grant's mind raced. This was bigger than just an illicit art gallery funding or a bitter divorce. This was a carefully constructed network that spanned continents, involving illegal arms trading, toxic substances, and shady business deals. Grant immediately contacted his colleagues in Europe, requesting that they look into the details of Volkov's businesses. Meanwhile, he started to investigate the local players in this covert operation. He knew that if Volkov and Moreno were involved in this, it wouldn't be long before their network reached someone who could help him break this open. The next day, Grant was given a breakthrough he hadn't expected. A local informant had come forward, someone who had worked as a security guard at one of Moreno's private properties, located on the outskirts of Clearwater. The guard, a nervous man named Jim, had been hesitant at first, but after several rounds of questioning, he cracked under pressure. He told Grant that he had seen a strange shipments arriving at the property in the middle of the night. Boxes of what appeared to be industrial chemicals, some of them marked with codes that Jim didn't recognize, but which he later realized were linked to the production of dangerous substances. "What exactly did you see?" Grant asked, his voice firm but measured. Jim swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. "I saw containers, Detective. Huge ones. Sometimes there were trucks, sometimes crates by air. It wasn't just chemicals. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like I was guarding a secret." "Did you ever see any of the people who were behind this?" Grant pressed. Jim hesitated, clearly on edge. "There was one man. He was always with Moreno. Never saw him before, but he was big, real dangerous looking. His name, I think it was Boris. He was the one handling most of the shipments. I'd see him go in and out, always with a couple of others. They were quiet, never made a sound." Grant's heart raced. Boris, it was an alias, no doubt, but it could be the key to unlocking this entire operation. He needed to find out more. With Jim's help, Grant was able to track down security footage from the property that had captured the mysterious figures loading and unloading the shipments. In one of the videos, a man wearing a black cap and a long coat was seen speaking with Victor Moreno, both of them standing near large crates marked with symbols resembling biohazard warnings. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough to confirm one thing: this was no ordinary business venture. The sky had begun to darken as Detective Samuel Grant and his team approached the remote villa on the outskirts of Clearwater. The place was nestled among thick trees, hidden from the main roads. It looked like a luxurious retreat, but to Grant, it was a place where dangerous men gathered to make decisions that could change the course of everything. This was where Victor Moreno and his partners were rumored to be meeting to discuss the future of their illicit empire. And Grant knew this was his chance to put an end to it all. His team was prepared, officers stationed at key points, surveillance ready, and a plan to enter the villa when the time was right. But something felt off. Grant had been in enough high-stakes situations to know that the closer he got to the truth, the more unpredictable things became. He had thought he was prepared for the danger he was about to face, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. Grant checked his phone one last time. The intel had been solid. Moreno would be in the villa by 9 p.m. There was no time to waste. He glanced around at his team and gave a final, silent nod. The operation was a go. Inside the villa, Victor Moreno stood before a large table, his hands clasped together, a cold smirk on his face. He was accompanied by a few key figures from his network. Boris, the towering figure from Eastern Europe, who stood just behind him, scanning the room with a watchful eye. Another man sat quietly in the corner, his face partially obscured by shadows. Someone Grant didn't recognize, but whose presence sent an immediate chill down his spine. "What's the status on the Clearwater project?" Moreno's voice was smooth, calculated. He looked at his associates with an air of superiority. He was in control, and everyone in the room knew it. Boris spoke first, his thick accent barely audible over the soft hum of the villa's air conditioning. "Everything is moving according to plan. The chemicals are ready for shipment, and the labs are being set up as we speak. It won't take long before everything is in place." Moreno nodded, his eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. "Good. And what about the art gallery, Olivia?" He didn't seem concerned, but there was a hint of curiosity in his tone. "She's been useful," Boris replied, his voice tinged with disdain. "But she's a liability. She's playing a bigger game than she realizes. She can't be trusted." Moreno considered this for a moment, then smiled. "It doesn't matter. She's already done what she needed to do. The rest of the pieces are in place. Once the chemicals are delivered, the art deals will take care of themselves. We'll be untouchable." But as the conversation continued, Grant was already inside the villa, moving through the darkened hallways with his team. Every step he took felt like it was one step closer to unraveling the truth. The air was thick with tension. They were getting closer to the heart of the operation, but they needed to move quickly. The last thing Grant wanted was for Moreno and his associates to escape. They reached the main conference room where Moreno and his men were gathered. Grant motioned to his team, signaling that it was time to move in. But just as they prepared to make their move, everything changed. A loud crash echoed through the villa, followed by the sound of distant shouting. Grant's heart raced. It was a diversion, a trap. Before he could react, the door to the conference room burst open and two armed men stormed in, their guns raised. Grant's team was caught off guard, and within seconds, chaos erupted. "Stay down," Grant yelled as shots rang out. The sound of gunfire echoed through the villa, and for a moment, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. Moreno's associates moved quickly, scrambling to grab weapons and take cover. Boris was already at the door, barking orders to the others, trying to regain control of the situation. Grant's team returned fire, taking up positions near the walls and doors. In the middle of the chaos, Grant caught a glimpse of Victor Moreno. He wasn't retreating into the shadows like most of the others. No, he was standing tall, a calm, calculating figure amid the violence. His eyes locked with Grant's for a split second, and in that brief moment, Grant saw something that chilled him to the bone, a glimmer of recognition, a knowing smile. "Did you really think you could stop this, detective?" Moreno's voice was eerily calm, even as bullets whizzed past him. Grant's heart pounded. He knows. The realization hit like a thunderclap. Moreno had anticipated this moment. He knew the investigation would eventually lead to him. But what he hadn't counted on was Grant being so close to the truth. What Grant didn't understand yet was how deeply involved Moreno was in this entire operation, how every move he made was a carefully orchestrated part of a larger plan. The gunfight raged on, but Grant's attention was fully on Moreno.